My key went into the lock. It just wouldn't turn. I stood there for a second, staring at my own front door like maybe grief had finally scrambled something in my head. I tried again. Nothing. Come on, I whispered, twisting harder. The key scraped against metal, but the deadbolt didn't move. I was still wearing the black dress I had worn to bury my husband. Daniel had been in the ground for less than 2 hours. All I wanted was to walk inside our house, take off my shoes, close the curtains, and disappear for the rest of the day. Then I noticed the suitcases. 2 of them were sitting beside the porch railing. Mine. A cardboard box had been placed next to them. I stepped closer. My shoes were inside. My toiletries. 3 sweaters. A framed photograph of Daniel and me from our anniversary. I stared at the box. Someone had been inside my house. I pounded on the door. Mom? Footsteps moved toward me from the other side. The door opened several inches. My mother stood there, not shocked to see me, not confused, calm, too calm. I looked at her, then at my useless key. Why can't I get into my house? She sighed like I had asked something inconvenient. We changed the locks. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. You what? We changed them, Clara. Why? She glanced behind herself before looking back at me. You've had a terrible day. You don't need to deal with this right now. I pushed my palm against the door. Deal with what? She stopped it with her foot. That was the moment something inside me shifted. My mother was physically blocking me from entering my own home. Move. Clara, don't start. Mom, I just buried my husband. Move away from my door. You're not staying here tonight. I actually laughed once because the sentence made so little sense. Excuse me? You can stay with your father and me for a while. Why would I stay with you when I have a house? Her expression hardened. Vanessa needs somewhere stable for the children. I stared at her. Then movement appeared behind her shoulder. My younger sister walked through my living room, not carrying boxes, not visiting, walking casually, comfortably. She was wearing slippers, my slippers, the soft grey pair I kept beside my bed. Vanessa? She froze. I looked past her. A child's backpack was sitting beside Daniel's favorite chair. There were toys near the coffee table, and on the shelf where Daniel and I kept our wedding photographs, Vanessa had already placed a framed picture of herself with her children. My stomach dropped. You moved her in? My mother opened the door another inch and lowered her voice. Keep your voice down. You moved my sister into my house while I was at my husband's funeral? Clara, give me the new key. My father appeared from the kitchen. Don't make a scene. I turned toward him. You're standing inside my house after changing the locks, and I'm the one making a scene? Robert rubbed his forehead. This is a practical decision. A decision made by who? No one answered. I looked from my father to my mother, then toward Vanessa. That was when I saw the empty space on the hallway wall. My wedding photograph. Gone. I pushed harder against the door. Where is Daniel's picture? Clara. I shoved past my mother just far enough to see into the living room. Daniel's watch box was missing from the cabinet. His laptop wasn't on the desk, and beneath that desk where he had kept a small locked document case for our mortgage paperwork, insurance records, and important files, there was nothing but an empty patch of carpet. I stopped moving. The anger drained out of me so fast it left something colder behind. I turned slowly toward my mother. Where's his laptop? She said nothing. Where's his watch? Still nothing. My eyes moved back to the empty space beneath the desk. And where is Daniel's document case? Vanessa looked at Mom. Dad looked away. That silence told me more than an answer would have. I stepped fully back onto the porch. A few minutes earlier, I had thought the worst thing waiting for me that day was an empty house. Now my sister was living inside it. My parents had changed the locks. My belongings were sitting outside, and some of my dead husband's most important possessions had disappeared. I looked directly at my mother. What did you do with my husband's things? My mother didn't answer. Instead, she folded her arms and gave me the same look she had used my entire life whenever she wanted me to believe my reaction was the real problem. Clara, you're exhausted, she said. You've been through an awful day. You need to sleep before we discuss any of this. I asked where Daniel's things are, and I heard you. Then answer me. Mom glanced toward Vanessa before lowering her voice. This is exactly why we didn't want to have this conversation today. You're emotional. There it was. Whenever Vanessa needed something, and I objected, somehow my objection became the issue. I stepped away from the doorway. I'm not leaving. Dad exhaled heavily. Margaret, let me talk to her. He came outside and pulled the door mostly closed behind him. as though we were discussing something private instead of the fact that my own family had locked me out of my home. Vanessa is having financial problems, he said. What does that have to do with my locks? She fell behind on her rent. I'm sorry to hear that. What does that have to do with my locks? Clara, she has children, and I have a house. My house. Dad's jaw tightened. She needed somewhere stable. So you gave her my home. Nobody gave her anything. She's using it. For how long? He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. I stared at him. For how long, Dad? We haven't decided. I almost couldn't believe the words. We. The front door opened again. Mom stepped onto the porch. You're twisting everything. No, Mom. I'm finally asking very simple questions. She crossed her arms. You've always been more capable than Vanessa. That sentence had followed me through childhood. Clara can handle it. Clara will understand. Clara doesn't need as much help. When I had problems, I was expected to solve them. When Vanessa had problems, the whole family reorganized itself around rescuing her. Daniel had been the first person who called it what it was. You can help people without handing them control of your life. He had once told me after Mom pressured us to cover one of Vanessa's bills. Now Daniel was gone. And before the flowers from his funeral had even begun to wilt, my parents were testing whether his boundaries had died with him. Mom stepped closer. You told me yourself that if anything happened to Daniel, you wouldn't want to stay here. I stared at her. Then I remembered. Months earlier, during one of Daniel's hospital stays, I had broken down in my mother's kitchen. I had said, I can't imagine living in that house without him. That was all. I looked at her in disbelief. I said I couldn't imagine living here without Daniel. Exactly. No, not exactly. I never said Vanessa could move in. You said you didn't want the house. I said I couldn't imagine my husband dying. Mom's face hardened. You're arguing over words. They're my words. I held out my hand. Give me the new key. No. The answer came instantly. Where's Daniel's watch? Safe. His laptop? Safe. The document case? Also safe. Then bring them to me. She didn't move. Mom, bring me Daniel's things. You don't need to be going through paperwork tonight. That answer changed everything. I stopped arguing. I pulled out my phone. Dad frowned. What are you doing? I photographed the suitcases, then the cardboard box, then the new lock. Clara, I took another picture through the open doorway. Vanessa's bags were stacked near the stairs. Stop taking pictures, Mom snapped. I looked at her. Why? Nobody answered. So I kept going. For the first time that afternoon, I wasn't trying to convince them that what they had done was wrong. I was documenting it. Dad and Mom went inside, arguing quietly. Vanessa remained near the doorway. After a few seconds, she stepped outside. She looked nothing like the confident sister I had seen walking through my living room minutes earlier. Clara? What? She glanced toward the house. Mom told me you already agreed. I lowered my phone. Agreed to what? To me being here. I didn't. Her face changed. She said you weren't going to keep the house. Vanessa, what exactly did Mom tell you? She hesitated. That after Daniel died, you were planning to sign it over because you couldn't afford it alone. For several seconds, I just stared at her, not because of the cruelty of the statement, because of one specific detail. Afford it. Daniel and I never discussed our mortgage with Vanessa. I had never told her what we owed. I had never told Mom either. Yet somehow my mother had been talking about whether I could afford my own house before Daniel was even buried. I stepped away from the porch and opened my banking app, then my email. I typed Daniel's name into the search bar and started pulling up every financial record I could access. Clara? Vanessa whispered. I barely heard her, because the question was no longer why my parents had moved my sister into my house. The question was how much they already knew about a house whose finances were none of their business, and I was going to find out. My phone rang before I finished searching Daniel's financial records. Martin's name appeared on the screen. Daniel had known Martin for almost 20 years. He had been at the funeral that morning, standing a few rows behind me, and Daniel had trusted him enough to involve him when we organized important estate matters. I answered immediately. Martin? Clara, where are you? Outside my house? There was a pause. Why outside? I looked at the new lock. That's complicated. Well, I think something else just became complicated. What happened? His voice lowered. I've had 2 people ask me about Vanessa getting your house. I stopped scrolling. What? Your aunt mentioned it first. Then your cousin asked whether Daniel had known you planned to give the property to your sister. My hand tightened around the phone. I never gave Vanessa my house. I didn't think you had. Who told them? Another pause. Your mother seems to be the source. That was when I understood what Mom had done. Changing the locks wasn't enough. She had already created a story around it. If enough relatives believed I had willingly given Vanessa the house, then when I objected, I wouldn't look like someone fighting to regain her own property. I would look like someone cruelly taking back a promise from a struggling mother. Clara, Martin said, I'll call you back. I ended the call. Vanessa was still standing nearby. Where are Mom and Dad going? She looked confused. Back home, I think. Good, I picked up my handbag, because we're going too. 20 minutes later, I walked into my parents' house. Several relatives were still there from the funeral reception. Coffee cups covered the dining table. Plates of untouched food sat on the counter. Conversation stopped almost immediately when I entered. Mom came from the kitchen. What are you doing here? I need to ask you something. Not now. Actually, now is perfect. Dad stood. Clara, I kept my voice level. When did I agree to give Vanessa my house? Nobody moved. Mum's eyes flicked toward the relatives around us. This is not appropriate. You told people I gave Vanessa the house, so when did I agree? Clara, you're grieving. Show me the agreement. Her lips tightened. You know perfectly well we discussed your plans. No, you discussed my plans. Dad stepped forward. This should be private. I looked around the room. Then why does everyone here apparently know I gave my sister my house? Silence. My aunt slowly put down her coffee cup. Mom's face reddened. You said you couldn't stay there after Daniel. I said I couldn't imagine living there without my husband. You turned that into permission to change my locks while I was burying him. Someone inhaled sharply behind me. Mom immediately pointed toward me. See, this is what I mean. She's not thinking clearly. I'm thinking clearly enough to ask 4 questions. I counted them on my fingers. When did I agree to give Vanessa the house? Where is the agreement? Why were my locks changed during Daniel's funeral? And why were my belongings put on the porch? Mom said nothing. Then Vanessa spoke. Mom told me it was already settled. Every face turned toward her. Margaret stared at Vanessa. Stay out of this. I'm already in it. You moved me into her house. You needed somewhere to live. Vanessa looked at me, then back at Mom. You said Clara agreed. Mom shook her head. I said Clara understood what needed to happen. That isn't the same thing, I said. The atmosphere in the room shifted. I could see it on people's faces. Until that moment, Mom had controlled the story. Now Vanessa herself was contradicting her. I turned to my sister. When did Mom first tell you to start moving? Vanessa, her eyes dropped. Before the funeral. How long before? Mom interrupted. That's irrelevant. I didn't look at her. How long? Vanessa swallowed. 4 days. The room went completely silent. 4 days. My parents hadn't seen me return from Daniel's funeral devastated and impulsively decided I shouldn't be alone. They had planned this while I was preparing to bury him. Show me your phone. Mom stepped forward. Vanessa, don't. That was all Vanessa needed to hear. She unlocked her phone. She scrolled through her messages and handed it to me. There it was. Mom had told Vanessa to reserve the moving van 4 days before Daniel's funeral. Another message discussed timing. The funeral would give them several hours to get everything settled. Then another, don't bother Clara with this beforehand. She'll only complicate things. I photographed the screen. Mom reached for the phone. That was taken out of context. What context makes it okay? I was trying to solve a problem. You used my husband's funeral as a moving window. You weren't going to stay in that house. You don't know that. You can't maintain a place like that alone, she snapped. Vanessa has children. She needs stability. You need to stop being selfish and think about somebody besides yourself. I stared at her. Then I finally understood the part she still didn't. She genuinely believed my grief had weakened my ownership. I put my phone into my bag. I'm not giving Vanessa the house. Mom's mouth opened. I want access restored, and I want everything you removed returned. You're making a terrible mistake. No, you made one. I turned toward the door. For the first time that day, nobody tried to stop me. Then Vanessa called my name, Clara. Something in her voice made me turn around. She was staring at Mom, not me. Her face had gone pale. There's something else. Mom moved immediately. Vanessa, enough. Vanessa ignored her. Clara, Mom took Daniel's document case before the locksmith even arrived. I turned around so fast my handbag slipped from my shoulder. What did you just say? Vanessa looked at Mom, then back at me. The document case, the black one. I know which case you mean. Mom stepped between us. This conversation is finished. No, I said. It just changed. I moved around her. When did she take it? Vanessa rubbed her palms together. When we first got to your house, before the locksmith came, my stomach tightened. So before anyone changed my locks, Mum was already going through Daniel's things. I didn't see her open it then. She carried it into the dining room. What did she say? Vanessa hesitated. She said it was paperwork you didn't need to worry about yet. I looked at my mother. Daniel had kept our most important household documents in that case. Mortgage statements, insurance information, property records. Anything we didn't want lost in a drawer somewhere went inside it, and my mother had removed it before the locks were even changed. That meant the missing case wasn't an afterthought. I pulled out my phone. Mom's voice sharpened. Who are you calling? Martin. Clara. Stop turning this into something it isn't. I looked directly at her. I don't know what this is yet. That's why I'm finding out. Martin answered on the second ring. Clara, I need your help. I walked outside while everyone remained behind me. I told him everything, the changed locks, my suitcases on the porch, Vanessa already living inside, Daniel's laptop, his watch, the document case. Then I told him about the messages showing Mom had arranged the move 4 days before the funeral. Martin was silent for several seconds. Finally, he said, "Stop treating this like a family argument." I leaned against my car. What do you mean? Your residence can be documented. Ownership can be documented. If personal property has been removed, that can be documented too. You have photographs? Yes. Messages? Yes. Keep everything. I looked back through my parents' front window. Mom was watching me. Martin, I just want Daniel's things back. Then create a record of exactly what happened. That sentence settled something for me. For hours, Mom had depended on everything remaining inside the family. Family could be pressured. Family could be guilted. Family could be told to calm down. Records were different. I made the report. I documented that I had returned to my residence and discovered the locks changed without my permission. I documented the belongings left outside. I listed Daniel's laptop, his watch, and the document case among the items I could no longer locate. I provided the photographs. Then I saved screenshots of Vanessa's messages in more than one place. By the time I finished, Dad had called me 6 times. I finally answered, Clara. His voice had changed. No commands now. No telling me not to make a scene. We need to talk. We already did. We can work something out. There's nothing to work out. Return everything that was removed from my house. Your mother put those things somewhere safe. Then returning them should be easy. He sighed. Come on. Vanessa has nowhere else to go. This isn't about Vanessa anymore. Of course it is. No, Dad. Mom took Daniel's document case before the locksmith arrived. Why? Silence. Ask your mother to return it. Another pause. Then I heard Mom's voice in the background. Dad muffled the phone, but not enough. A few seconds later, Mom came on the line. You can have the case after we settle the arrangement with Vanessa. I almost couldn't believe she had said it. You're refusing to return Daniel's documents unless I negotiate over my house? I'm saying everybody needs to behave reasonably. Put the case back, Clara. Put everything back. I ended the call. A minute later, another message appeared. This one was from Vanessa. There was no text at first, just a photograph. I enlarged it. It had been taken inside my dining room while they were moving. The black document case was sitting on the table. Beside it was a locksmith invoice. And beside that was a yellow notepad covered in my mother's handwriting. I zoomed in. One line contained an estimated value for my house. Another said, remaining mortgage? Below it, transfer before sale? I stared at those words. My parents hadn't simply been looking for somewhere Vanessa could sleep. Someone had been investigating what my house was worth. Someone wanted to know how much debt remained against it. And my husband's death had apparently made my mother think there was an opportunity to answer those questions. But one thing still didn't make sense. What had she actually found inside Daniel's case? I sent the photograph to Martin. Then I stopped negotiating. With the report already made and my evidence preserved, I moved forward with establishing my right to regain access and recover the property that had been removed. When I returned to the house with authorities present, Mom's confidence was gone. She stood inside the living room with her arms crossed. Dad stayed near the kitchen. Vanessa had moved her children upstairs away from the confrontation. I entered my own home for the first time since leaving that morning to bury Daniel. Everything looked familiar and wrong at the same time. "Where is the case?" I asked. Mom didn't answer. One of the officers repeated the question. Dad finally pointed toward the dining room. The black case was placed on the table. I walked toward it. The lock was no longer secured. Someone had opened it. My throat tightened. Daniel had been meticulous about that case. He kept the keys separately and never left it unsecured. Now the lid wasn't even completely closed. I reached toward it. Mom suddenly moved. Fast. Her hand shot past me toward a folder sticking out from beneath the lid. The officer beside me immediately stepped between us. "Mom, don't touch that." Mom froze. Her fingers were inches from the folder. I looked at her hand, then at her face. Whatever was inside that folder, my mother had just tried to grab it with an officer standing beside her. And now everyone in the room had seen her do it. The officer kept one hand between my mother and the dining table. "Ma'am, step back." Mom didn't move at first. Her eyes stayed fixed on the folder. "Margaret," Dad said quietly. She finally took 2 steps backward. I reached into Daniel's document case and pulled the folder free. My hands were trembling, but this time it wasn't because I was standing outside my home begging someone to let me inside. I was standing at my own dining table. My mother was the one being told where she could stand. I opened the folder. The first document was the deed and ownership paperwork for the house. Behind it were mortgage statements Daniel had carefully organized by date, then insurance documents, estate paperwork, correspondence relating to the property, everything Daniel had kept together so that if something happened, I wouldn't have to search through drawers and email accounts trying to understand our finances. I sat down. The mortgage statements caught my attention. Daniel had been making substantial additional payments toward the principal. I knew we had been paying extra when possible, but seeing the records together made the scale of it clear. The remaining balance was far lower than someone casually looking at the house would have assumed. That meant the equity was much higher. And beside the document case in my mother's handwriting was an estimated value for the property, remaining mortgage transfer before sale. I looked up. "Is this what you were looking for?" Mom's expression tightened. "I was trying to understand the situation." "What situation?" "Your financial situation." "My financial situation is none of your business. You just lost your husband." "Yes, I did." And somebody had to think practically. I held up one of the mortgage statements. "So while I was arranging Daniel's funeral, you were thinking about how much equity was in my house?" "That's not what happened." "Then tell me what happened." Mom looked toward Dad. He said nothing. Vanessa had come downstairs and was standing near the hallway now. I placed the statement back on the table. Vanessa showed me the messages. Mom's face changed. "She showed me when you told her to reserve the moving van." "Clara, 4 days before Daniel's funeral." Nobody interrupted me. "You knew Vanessa needed somewhere to live. Instead of asking me, you decided my house would solve her problem. We knew what you would say." "Exactly. You knew I hadn't agreed." Mom opened her mouth, but I continued. "You arranged the move before the funeral. You knew I'd be gone for hours. You told Vanessa not to speak to me because I would complicate things. Then, while I was burying my husband, Dad helped you move her inside. You changed my locks. You put my belongings on the porch. You removed Daniel's laptop and watch. And before the locksmith even arrived, you took this case. I put my hand on it. The room was completely silent. Then you opened it." Mom's voice dropped. "We needed to know what you were dealing with." "No, you wanted to know what the house was worth." I was trying to protect both my daughters. I looked at the handwritten notes again. "By figuring out whether the house could be transferred before it was sold." She looked away. That was the answer. There was no hidden agreement, no promise I had forgotten making, no legal reason Vanessa belonged inside my house. My mother had taken one sentence I said while terrified of losing Daniel, one sentence about not being able to imagine living without him, and turned it into permission. Then she discovered the house had far more equity than she expected. And what began as her solution to Vanessa's housing problem became something bigger. If she could convince me that I didn't need the house, that I couldn't maintain it, that Vanessa deserved it more, then perhaps I could be pressured into transferring it on favorable terms instead of simply controlling what was mine. My grief was supposed to make that easier. Mum stepped toward me. "You're making this sound calculated." I stared at her. "You scheduled a moving van around my husband's funeral." Her mouth closed. I returned the documents to the case one by one. Deed, mortgage records, insurance documents, estate paperwork. I didn't scream, I didn't need to. Finally, I closed the lid. Mom spoke again. "I was protecting you." I looked at her. From what? From making emotional decisions. I almost laughed. "You changed my locks while I was burying Daniel." She shook her head. "You shouldn't have been alone in this house afterward. Then you could have asked me to stay with you. You would have refused. Then that would have been my decision." Dad finally came forward. "We're sorry." I looked at him. For 1 second, I thought he understood. Then he continued. "But you have to understand our position too. Vanessa was desperate. You have a much bigger house than you need. And after Daniel, stop, he did. You're apologizing and defending it in the same sentence. That's not what I'm doing. It is exactly what you're doing." Dad rubbed his forehead. "We genuinely didn't think you'd want to stay here. You didn't ask. You said, I know what I said. I stood. I said I couldn't imagine living here without Daniel. I never said you could take my house." Vanessa stepped into the dining room. Her eyes were red. "Mum told me Clara had already agreed." Margaret turned sharply. "Vanessa, don't start." "No, I need to say this. You needed a home, and I found you one." Vanessa looked around my dining room. "This wasn't yours to find." Mom stared at her. "After everything your father and I have done for you, you're taking her side." "This isn't about sides." "Of course it is." Vanessa shook her head. "If I had known Clara said no, I never would have moved in." I looked at my sister. I wasn't ready to forgive her. She had walked into my house without calling me. She had put her photographs on my shelves. She had worn my slippers. But I could also see something now that I hadn't understood when I first saw her behind my mother at the door. Vanessa had been lied to too. Mom pointed at her. "You'd be homeless if it weren't for us." Vanessa's voice became quieter. "Being helped doesn't make stolen permission legitimate." Mom looked as if Vanessa had slapped her. The practical consequences moved quickly after that. My access to the house was restored. The locks my parents had installed were replaced again, except this time I controlled the keys. Vanessa was required to move her belongings out. Because she cooperated once she understood what had happened, I gave her a short, clearly documented period to collect everything. Not indefinitely, not until Mom decided she was ready. A deadline, Vanessa agreed. Daniel's laptop was returned. His watch came back too. I went room by room and made an inventory of everything that belonged to Daniel and me. Anything I couldn't immediately account for was documented. The photographs I had taken mattered. The screenshots mattered. The locksmith invoice mattered. Vanessa's messages mattered. Even the open document case mattered. My parents could tell relatives whatever version they wanted, but they couldn't make those things disappear. I also got professional legal guidance concerning the property and Daniel's estate paperwork. The answer was simple. Family opinion did not override documented ownership. Being my parents didn't give Margaret and Robert authority over my home. Being my sister didn't give Vanessa a right to live there without my permission. And being recently widowed didn't make me incapable of deciding what happened to property that was legally mine. Within days, the story Mom had told our relatives began collapsing. She had originally made it sound as if I had generously decided Vanessa needed the house more than I did. Now people knew what had actually happened. The question was no longer, why won't Clara help Vanessa? It became the question Mom couldn't answer. Why did you change Clara's locks while she was burying Daniel? Mom stopped responding to relatives who asked. Dad called me privately. Can you please tell everyone this was a misunderstanding? I was standing in my living room when he asked. Daniel's chair was beside me. My wedding photograph still hadn't been returned to the wall. A misunderstanding is when somebody hears the wrong time for dinner. Clara, you hired a locksmith. We made a mistake. Then say that. We have. No. You keep saying you made a mistake and then explaining why you were entitled to make it. Dad went silent. I'm not calling anyone, I said. I'm not campaigning against you either, but I'm not lying for you. I ended the call. That became the biggest change. For years, my family had treated my stability like a shared resource. If Vanessa needed money, I was supposed to understand. If mom needed something, I was supposed to make room. If I objected, I was difficult because I was the one who could supposedly handle more. Daniel had seen it before I did. Helping someone was a choice. Being used was not. Weeks later, Vanessa finished moving out. Our relationship wasn't magically repaired. I told her plainly that even if mom had claimed I agreed, she should have called me before moving into my home. Vanessa admitted that. She found another temporary living arrangement. We spoke occasionally after that, but with boundaries neither of us could pretend weren't necessary. With my parents, the damage went deeper. Mom asked for a spare key once. I said no. Dad suggested keeping one for emergencies. I said no again. There would be no spare key at their house. There would be no discussion about transferring my property. And there would be no more family meetings where everyone except me decided what I should sacrifice. Slowly, I began putting the house back together. Vanessa's photographs disappeared from the shelves. The toys were gone. My clothes came back inside. Daniel's watch returned to its place. His laptop went back on the desk. And one afternoon, I picked up the framed wedding photograph my parents had removed. Daniel was smiling at me in the picture. I remembered exactly when it was taken. I hung it back on the wall. I left his chair where it had always been. I still didn't know whether I would live in that house forever. Maybe one day I would sell it. Maybe I wouldn't. Maybe eventually the memories would feel comforting instead of unbearable. But for the first time since Daniel died, I understood that I didn't need to make that decision for anybody else. Not for mom, not for dad, not for Vanessa. It was mine to make. One evening, I came home and stood on the same porch where everything had started. There were no suitcases beside the railing, no cardboard boxes filled with my belongings. Nobody was watching me from behind a door they had decided I couldn't open. I took the new key from my bag. For a second, I remembered the afternoon of Daniel's funeral, the old key refusing to turn, Mom opening the door, Vanessa walking through my living room, Daniel's things missing. That horrible realization that while I had been saying goodbye to my husband, my own family had been deciding what else I was going to lose. Then I put the new key into the lock. It turned. I opened the door and stepped inside. The day I buried my husband, my family tried to convince me I had lost my home too. They were wrong.